At 6 a.m. on April 13th, over 13,800 polling stations across 253 electoral districts nationwide opened their doors to voters for Korea's 20th general elections. Up for grabs were 300 seats in the National Assembly to be determined by 42 million eligible voters. The National Election Commission put the voter turnout at 58% this year, a slight uptick from 54.2% 4 years ago. How did each party fare? The ruling Saenuri Party failed to secure a majority in parliament, while the main opposition, the Minjoo Party of Korea, outperformed others. The newly founded opposition group, the People's Party, secured not only an assembly negotiating bloc, but has emerged as a force that can swing votes. Newly elected lawmakers will be sworn in on May 30th. We'll take a look at what to expect in the following 4 years to come.
Welcome to News Inside. I'm An Jung-hyun. We're once again joined by our panelists, Professor Shin Sang-hyuk, great to have you back, and Dr. Kong Yoon-sik. Thanks for coming back. So on Wednesday, people across the nation went to the polls for the 20th general elections, delivering their voices through their votes. Let's talk about the results. So, first of all, did you vote?
Yes, I did.
And were you surprised by the results?
Oh, well, it was very surprised, but I think, this is the fact facing us, and then I think in some sense, it is a kind of some desirable outcome for the future Korean politics, I think.
I think all the major parties were in a bit of a shock as well.
Right. Even the opposition parties who scored the big time were surprised by the result. And this will be a kind of a divide line in the history of party politics in South Korea. It was the first time in the past 16 years that the opposition party has become the majority party, which happened in 1998. So we'll see what's going to happen in the remaining tenure of the Park Geun-hye administration.
Now, voter turnout was higher than expected as well, at 58%, even higher than the previous general elections. What do you think contributed to this higher turnout?
Yes, at the 18th general election, the voter turnout was 46.1%, and at the 19th election, it was 54.2%. And as you mentioned already, at this 20th general election, the voter turnout reached 58%, which is about the 30.8% higher than the previous one. I think there are two main reasons. The first one is for the first time in the parliamentary election, the early voting system was introduced. I think maybe as we know very well about the voter turnout rate at the early voting, election was about 12%. So it certainly contributed to increase the voter turnout rate at this general election. Second one is that, as you know very well, among the 253 districts, at the 120 districts, there is severe competition among candidates. So it can be one of the strong motivations for supporters to cast a vote, I think.
Now, why is it so difficult to break the 60% mark?
Well, that's surprising and disappointing at the same time. But 58% must be considered as a very reasonably high voting rate in any circumstances. I think two main factors contributed to a rather disappointing voting rate this time. One is that voters were disappointed by a very noisy and ugly nomination process, which was not only confined to the ruling party, Saenuri Party, but also opposition parties. Second point is that, voters were disappointed by the quality of some candidates, that they complained that if we do not have any candidate we regard worth voting for, then there should be a box saying that not this time. So combination of the disappointments for the very ugly nomination process and the lack of viable candidates is accountable for the relatively low voting rate this time.
It seems the early voting system that Professor Shin mentioned did play a significant part here, contributing to the overall turnout.
Right, 12.2%. And I'm one of the 12.2% who actually
You
took
did.
advantage of the early voting system, which was taken for the first time for this general National Assembly election. I had to do it for the sake of experiencing it.
I see.
And, I mean, it widened the opportunities for the voters to cast their ballots, right? So I think
it ended up encouraging other voters to go vote themselves.
right.
Because
I was one of the people who actually spread the words that I voted already, so you better, go and join us. So I think it creates a very positive ripple effect, and there's a controversy regarding the adoption of the early voting because it would extend the voting time. But at the same time, it has a positive upside in terms of inviting more voters to cast their ballots. So we'll see. Once the voters will be used to this early voting system, then I think the overall voting rate will continue to rise.
now, one decisive factor in almost every election is the different age groups who show up to vote, the turnout within these voting blocks. What do you think this says about our society as a whole?
Well, I think it's better for us to quote the result of one of the enquete before the election. According to the enquete, there were big changes in the 20s. There was a question asking whether you are going to cast a vote or not. Well, at the 90s election, actually the yes answer was about only 35.9%. But at the 20s election, about the 53.4% the person said yes. They answered they would cast a vote. This is a big increase in the 20s. And how about the 30s, in the 30s? Well, at the 19th election, the person who said yes was the 49.4%, but at the 20th election, the answer was yes answer was about 58.3%, which was 8.9% higher than the previous one. In sum, at the 20s and 30s, the age groups, there were certainly big changes in the attitude toward the general election.
And there are theories that the younger the voters, the more likely a victory for progressive or
opposition
liberals,
party,
right?
yes. And how about the 60s? Actually, to make a long story short, there are no big changes. Rather, there was trends that in the 60s, they answered that they would, the person who would participate in the voting was a little bit reduced. So considering this kind of things, definitely, the opposition party could took some advantages in this at this 20th general election, I think.
Well, let's now zoom out a little bit to take a look at the broader picture with a recap of this year's elections.
With the electoral map finalized on March 2nd, the stage for Korea's 20th general election was set. But prolonged negotiations over redrawing the electoral map had an impact on candidate nominations as well. Squabbles within political parties lasted until the final day of candidate registration, leaving voters with less time to learn about their candidates and their pledges. This is why the 13-day window for election campaigning led to fiercer competition among candidates, often using flashy and eye-catching promotional tools to draw attention. Voters also dedicated their time to learn more about the candidates through news reports and other tools. And in the midst of all this, the first ballots were cast overseas. A total of 63,800 people took part in the elections at 198 polling stations set up in 113 countries around the world. In the two-day early voting session, fresh records were set. Out of the total 42 million eligible voters, 5.1 million cast their ballots. And on Election Day, April 13th, voters came out to cast their votes across the country during a span of 12 hours. With this, the elections have come to a close, but voters will need to continue to watch the 300 lawmakers elected to their seats in the National Assembly.
Now, there had been criticism that this year's elections were lacking three things, namely people's interest, prominent issues, and political alliances. In your mind, what stood out the most about this year's elections?
Well, people may point out the lack of the three main things, but at the same time, the opposition party succeeded in highlighting at least one central issue, which is the very poor performance of national economy and who should be held responsible for that. And the ruling party would criticize the opposition party pulling the leg of the executive branch of the government by engaging delay tactics at the National Assembly, including the previous filibustering with regard to the potential passage of the bills for injecting more flexibility in the job market and whatnot. But at the same time, opposition party argue that see, we are very weak and small in National Assembly, so our opposition should not be regarded as a main reason for failed policy making, and the Blue House and the ruling party should be held responsible for it. And it seems like the voters were inclined to accepting the latter argument in criticism of the Blue House and the ruling party.
Yeah, well, one of the interesting variables was that it was the ruling party against a number of opposition forces, leading many to believe that the ruling party would benefit from the opposition split.
Right.
The results show otherwise. What do you think happened?
Well, in other words, definitely the voters took the noisy candidate nomination procedure in the ruling party as more serious factors and variables when they decided to whom they cast the vote. Definitely. Well, according to the analysis before the election, many the experts said that because the opposition party has been split, so definitely it can be a big advantage for the ruling party. But as you mentioned already, the result is totally different from our expectations. So I think in the candidate nomination procedure, particularly in the ruling party, definitely it made us, the voters, be disappointed. And then I think I want to add this point. Without this kind of the outcome, where the ruling party could have the win at the presidential election, the people's mind can change very rapidly, but in the other side of the coin, maybe once they love someone, it will take a time to give up their love toward someone. What I mean is that maybe it can be a kind of some good punishment for the ruling party in some sense.
Ahead of the presidential
election.
election.
It is another chance for them. If they do better job at the National Assembly, Parliament, maybe they could take some advantages in the presidential election. I want to underline this point.
Well, yes, one reason why the outcome of this year's elections is being followed more closely is because we have a presidential election coming up next year. So do we now have more clues as to where things are headed?
We have more clues that we have less clue who is going to be the prominent candidate in the presidential election, because all those so-called forerunners in the upcoming presidential elections were lost in these elections, including the ex-mayor of Seoul, Mr. Oh Se-un, and the former president of the opposition party, the Minjoo Party of Korea, Mr. Moon Jae-in, promised that if the party did not do well in the Gwangju and Jeolla province, then he would step down and give up all the vested interest. And it seems like the result would have put a tremendous amount of pressure on him. And a lot of other, forerunners did not do well in the election. So it's a wide open area, which will be a very interesting point to observe in the near future.
Well, we have about a year and a half to go, so anything could happen.
That could be a very interesting and important topic for this News Insight.
Well, election results bring to the forefront the voice of the people and their sentiment toward politics. So let's break down the results in terms of wins and losses. Now, no party has secured a majority, but it obviously is a win for the opposition as a whole, despite the split and all the controversies thereafter. What do you think contributed the most to this?
there are no promises, pledges suggested by the parties, ruling party and from the opposition parties. So I think the people put the priorities on the procedure, particularly in selecting the candidate nomination procedure. As you know very well, definitely in the ruling party, it was, it seems to be more serious than the happening in the opposition party, particularly in the Minjoo Party, Democratic Party. Mr. Kim Jong-in joined, and after he joined to the Minjoo Party, I think he did a quite good job. He is one of the few persons who suggested a kind of pledges. He said that economic democratization. Well, we are facing very serious economic difficulties. And he suggests that, he's against some proposal, suggestion from the ruling party. After he suggested so-called economic democratization, in response to his suggestion from the ruling party, they said that so-called to revitalize depressed economy, they wanted to adopt so-called quantitative easing policy. But for the grassroots people, definitely, it could not be accepted easily because the government already had adopted the quantitative easing policy in some sense. Then, what kind of further effects we could effect? That is kind of some response from the grassroots people, working level people. In this context, I think Mr. Kim Jong-in's the suggestion, about the economic democratization. Could be understood, accepted by the grassroots people as more tangible, practical policy which can overcome the financial crisis or economic crisis we are facing.
Well, the squabble over the Saenuri Party nomination process, other than that factor, could there be other factors that played into this that resulted in the loss of Saenuri Party? For example, people's disappointment with the current ruling party or the incumbent administration.
Right. It was very surprising considering that President Park Geun-hye has been enjoying very high approval rate, hovering at 40%, which last show we discussed as a positive element that will likely contribute to the sweeping victory of the ruling party, Saenuri Party. But it seems like the voters clearly separate their support for the president's office and their support for the ruling party. So the lame duck syndrome is going to take place very immediately. Another reason why people did not support the Saenuri Party was not only the squabbling during the nomination process, but also lack of a clear vision about what to do with difficult economic situations. If you recall the way that the candidates from the Saenuri Party waged the election campaigns, it's all about apology. Apologies, kneeling down in the street, apology for people suffering and difficult situation, but they failed to provide the answer to the problems that they somehow admitted that they own the problems. And they argue that electing them would provide good protection for the President Park Geun-hye. But without providing clear vision, people may not be really convinced whether the elections will actually generate the effect to improve the quality of decision making, especially in terms of economic issues by the Blue House and the National Assembly.
In fact, they missed the golden chance, opportunity to defend themselves because of the very noisy candidate elimination process. Well, they wasted time. They spent their energies between the different political frictions. So they should defend themselves. Why they could not? We could not avoid the economic crisis. There are certainly more external factors rather than internal factors resulted in the economic difficulties facing us. But they did not explain or defend very logically or efficiently why we face such a serious economic difficulties and how we overcome the economic difficulties. They did not, they were not very successful in defending those kind of things.
Right. I absolutely agree with Professor Sin's remark. They were running against the deadline. against the time, and they lost the golden opportunity to actually explain their situations and reasons. But the squabble only make them monopolize the spotlight of the media, but only for the negative effect.
Yeah. So, how do you see things playing out at the National Assembly from here on out? We have an opposition that is bigger than the ruling camp now.
Well, as Dr. Bong pointed out, definitely the Blue House and the government will have very serious difficulties in implementing the policies.
Right.
As we know very well, there have been some conflicts between the ruling party and opposition party on the economic policies. How to overcome the economic difficulties. Well, from the government side, the government tried to use they have waited for the launch of the 20th Congress to pass the labor-related bills at the parliament. But I think it will be very difficult for them to pass them. And this can be some foundation for the economic revitalization in Korea, but which means that the government will have serious difficulties in an effort to revitalize the economy. And certainly second point which I want to emphasize that the Korean President Park Geun-hye personally, she will have a very difficult time because she have about the 1 year and 10 months presidential tenure. But I think during the remaining this period, definitely I doubt what she could do. So she will put more the priorities on the dialogue with the opposition party. That means that her leadership, should be changed in some sense. We have criticized her a lot many times because of lack of the communication, lack of dialogue with the opposition parties, even with the ruling party. So I think this can be a kind of some turning point for her in changing her leadership, but particularly how to communicate with the parliament. Thirdly, she should select a few policies. She should privatize the policies she will implement in the remaining her tenure, because that I think considering the balance of power in the parliament, definitely she could not implement what she wanted to do at one time. So she has to seriously consider which policy she wants to implement first.
Regarding all those, I'm afraid we cannot really avoid gridlock syndrome in the upcoming National Assembly, because not only the Blue House has to deal with its own party, but also opposition party. But now it's not just the one opposition party to be reckoned with, but two opposition parties. So whatever the Blue House and the ruling party will do, try to bring the opposition parties on the same page in terms of passing those critical bills for economic revitalization. But another wildcard is the communication and agreement between the two opposition parties this time.
Together they form a majority.
It's more complicated matrix that the Blue House has to play with as a part of the reality. And another important variable is the National Assembly Advancement Law, that any critical issues that are deadlocked between the ruling parties and opposition party should get more than absolute majority votes to get passed. But now, since the Minjoo Party of Korea has become the #1 majority party, the Speaker House is likely to come from the opposition parties. Then the Speaker House's own prerogative to interpret and implement the National Assembly's Advancement Law will not be out of hands of the Blue House or the ruling party. So it'll be a very difficult situation for Blue House and the ruling party to deal with in terms of speedy passage of the critical bills.
But one thing, if I want to add it up, that is that maybe the relationship between the Blue House and the Saenuri Party, because of the result at the election, definitely there will be the more conflict between the different political frictions. They will just pass the bomb to each other. Because of you, we lost the election. So there will be severe competition or conflict among the different political friction. I think this is the first and the most imminent the task, question they should find an answer. Otherwise, that maybe people will show their back continuous to the the Saenuri Party. I think.
We need to first see whether they will be successful in keeping the house in order before they will begin to be talking to the neighbors.
Well, how about in addition to keeping the house in order, bringing back members who've left the party? I think there might be efforts toward that
Definitely. But the Yoon Sang-hyun and then maybe Yoo Seung-min, he himself declared that he will return to the party if he wins. So 2 seats they can add it up, and then maybe they can take the majority in the at the parliament. I mean, it's not very decisive one, but I think the maybe Saenuri Party will make every effort to let them come back to the party. Why not?
But the problem is, I believe that you're correct in terms of Saenuri Party leadership will do everything to bring in the independents back to the party. But bringing them will not make the Saenuri Party as an absolute majority party.
Right.
It will make the Saenuri Party as number 1 party, but they have to still deal with the situation which is totally outnumbered by the opposition party.
Right.
Well, it is said that presidential elections are indicative of people's hopes for the future, while general elections are reflective of people's sentiment towards the ruling party and the incumbent administration. So given the results we have here, what are they telling us?
I think they are telling us both stories, that voters were retrospective, but at the same time very progressive in casting their ballots this time. It is the voters' evaluation of the performance of the current administration, but at the same time, it is about pouring support for the political parties they favor or the political candidates they regard potential forerunners in the upcoming presidential election. The negative part of this is that voters cast their ballots in a way that would preemptively eliminate the presidential hopefuls they regard failing to meet the bill.
So this is a wake-up call for everyone.
Right.
The Blue House, the ruling party, as well as presidential hopefuls.
Right.
in the
Even the
opposition.
Minjoo Party of Korea, who is entitled to celebrate the huge victory, has to engage in a very deep introspection because the party was severely criticized and the voters turned their backs from them, from the party in the Jeolla province, which used to be the traditional power basis for the party.
Right. Well, let's now turn our attention to the next 4 years. Now, one of the issues weighing heavily on people's minds is, of course, the economy.
Yes.
There are many economic bills that are pending at the National Assembly, most of them pushed forward by the ruling party or the government. What will happen to them now?
Well, as I already explained very briefly, definitely there has been big differences in the stance about the economic policy between the Saenuri Party and the Democratic Party, which is the opposition party. I think according to the Saenuri Party, they stepped up their efforts to use the quantitative easing policy as a policy to promote the depressed economy. So the Minister of the Economy in Korea, Mr. Kang Bong-kyun, emphasized that this is the only one policy available to Korean government to revitalize depressed economy. But there have been the experts and the politicians, particularly from the opposition party, who are against this idea. Well, this is the party for big business conglomerates, which is the policy used by the ruling party over the last decades. And on the top of this one, definitely, because of the outcome results at the general election, definitely it will be very difficult for the Saenuri-dang or the Blue House to implement this policy. That means that there will be serious, the discussion about the economic policy. Which will be the appropriate for the Korean economy, considering current situations. And from the Minjoo Party, Democratic Party, they said that we have to take some measures to help the grassroots people, working level people, to to improve their economic welfare in the middle of the economic difficulties. So they will take a very different stance about the labor-related bill, which means that the government will have more difficult time in implementing the economic policy to revitalize the economy. As we discussed before, there are 4 the labor-related bills pending at the national parliament, which means that it will be very difficult for the Saenuri Party and the government to pass that bill. Then what kind of policy they can take? Without the bill, passing the bill, these bills, the quantitative easing policy cannot be very effective. So for the time being, the government will search for or prepare new economic policies, which is very negative, for the Korean economy itself. And then Vice Prime Minister and the Minister of the Economy, Yoo Il-ho, he had some interview in Washington. He emphasized the importance of quantitative easing policy, but I think everything is not very clear. Certainly, I hope personally, those kind of period, needed for the finalizing the economic policy. Of course, it can be made through the discussion between the ruling party and the opposition party. But I want to emphasize that the time period should be shortened as much as we can. Otherwise, we will lose the golden opportunity to overcome the economic difficulties facing us.
What about in terms of national security? The ruling and opposition parties have always had different approaches towards North Korea. Can we expect to see changes in inter-Korean relations?
There will be some changes expected to take place by reviewing the election platforms of the parties in this election. There are some commonalities, including the continued support for economic sanctions on North Korea after its fourth nuclear test, and improving the welfare of war veterans and the soldiers in charge. But other than these 2 common promises, there is a significant difference between the ruling party and the opposition parties in terms of mixing and matching pressure and engagement toward North Korea. The ruling party is still very steady and firm on continued pressure on North Korea. But at the same time, the opposition parties are far more open to the idea of beginning at least the exploratory dialogue with North Korea in combination of pressure and engagement. And North Korean leadership is going to have its party congress in May, and it is very likely for Kim Jong-un leadership to try to drive a wedge between these 2 different positions with regard to inter-Korean relations.
Well, how do you think the government will react to these different positions?
Well, that's a very interesting question. The Blue House may try to emphasize the urgent security threat to South Korea as a way to compensate for its relatively poor performance in terms of revival of national economy by pandering to people's concern for national security. And in that regard, then, we cannot avoid a very confrontational situation which may take place between the 2 Koreas, at least in near future.
Well, we say that every vote counts, and when we consider the costs and implications, it certainly seems to be no exaggeration. Apparently, a single vote has an economic value of about 40 million won.
Yes. Well, according to the economic paper in Korea, well, administration cost for 1 vote is only 6,791. But when we actually assess the value of the vote for the coming 4 years, it is, yes, it's about 40 million won. It's really a big one, big money, isn't it? According to the report, the calculation, the formula which get those kind of value of a vote is this one. For 4 years, if they elected, the congressman will serve for 4 years. For 4 years, they will deal with about the 1,700 trillion won. I mean, including the budget and
budgets,
everything.
right.
Yes, they divided this 1,700 trillion won divided by the total number of the voters, which was 42 million something. So it is the value of the one ballot actually can be estimated as the 4,280,000 won, which is really big money, isn't it? So I think yes. So why we think about this cost, the value of the cost? Definitely in the democratic system, the people should participate in the voting, isn't it? Mm-hmm. And then, as we discussed already, our voter turnout is only 58%. But I think we should draw the more people to cast a vote. When you look at the voter turnout rate in the 16th general election, 17th general election, it was much higher than 60%. Why the voter turnout fell down, under the 60%. I think this is the one thing we have to consider very seriously. Without participation, we cannot ask the politicians to do better job than they do right now at the moment.
So compared to previous general elections, in which areas do you think we saw progress and where could we have done better?
Well, the area that we have witnessed progress should be the decline of regionalism, regional voting, because we see opposition parties or ruling parties winning the districts, which used to be considered as an ironclad boundary, stronghold for the other parties. So that's a very promising signals for the future of party politics. And not as an area of disappointment, the area of interesting observation in near future would be whether the party politics in South Korea will be moving from the typical bipartisan competition that has dominated for the past 20 years to the early experimental multi-party competition with arrival of a People's Party as a legitimate third party this time.
So, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us. We wrapped up the election results in this session. Any last words before we go?
Well, I hope personally the result at the 20th general election is very different from our expectation. But I hope this can be a start of another takeoff in the Korean politics.
There are so many theories in political science about if a person is rational, he or she should not vote. It's a waste of time and effort because one vote will not make a critical difference with a millions votes. But people are more than just a rational calculator, but with a entity with hearts and values. So women in Afghanistan waited many hours in line secretly, hiding from the international terrorist group to cast their votes. And they would have been executed if their fingers were discovered tainted with ink to cast their votes. So casting votes is the first essential step toward liberal democracy. And we should not take it for granted here in South Korea.
Well, thank you two very much once again. That is all for this edition of News Inside. As we close, we will leave you with what people want to see from their newly elected lawmakers over the next 4 years. Thank you for watching. We'll be back with more next week.
항상 정책 같은 경우도 선거하기 전에만 공약을 생각하시지 마시고 당선된 후에도 지속적인 실현 가능한 공약들 위주로 생각을 해서 이어주셨으면 하는 바람입니다.
국회의원분들이 일단은 그 일반 국민들이나 시민들하고 좀 공감을 먼저 하시는 게 중요한 것 같아요. 일단은 먼저 좀 공감하고 뭐가 제일 시급한지 그런 것들을 생각하는 과정들이 좀 더 필요한 것 같아요.
이 문제에 대해서 이 문제가 어디서부터 시작해야 될 것인가에 대한 책임의식, 그걸 가지고서 서로 신뢰할 수 있는 그런 사회를 만들기 위한 몸부림이 정말 우리 국회의원들에게 필요하다고 생각합니다.
진짜 국민을 위한 정치가 어떤 건가 제발 좀 보여줬으면 좋겠고 진짜 진정성을 좀 보여줬으면 좋겠어요.
자기들 배만 먼저 생각하는 게 아니라 국민들을 먼저 생각하고 자신 가족처럼 정말 국민을 위한 일꾼이 되면 좋겠습니다.